Well, thank you, and thank you for having me. And one of the questions that was posed to me is partisan media the future? And I thought about it on the flight over, and I really think the short answer is it's the present. I mean, we're well beyond the point when, at least in America, maybe in the UK and on this side of the Atlantic, it's been an earlier tradition, but in America, we live in an environment now where partisan media is the present. And just wanted to talk briefly before I move on to Fox News about sort of how we got there, because it's actually an anomaly to think that media is, quote, objective. It was a vestige of the post-war system that grew up out of World War II, but the broader history of American media, newspapers principally, but then in broadcast as well, has been one of partisanship. You had in the radio age, you had partisan commentators stirring up populist political movements. In the early 20th century, you had highly partisan newspaper publishers. So the notion of objectivity in a nonpartisan media is actually a relatively new development that grew up at a time when you wanted mass audiences. If you were trying to reach the broadest swath of the population through a newspaper or a broadcast news television program, you would try to pitch it down the middle to capture as many eyeballs as possible. But through technology and changing regulation, the sort of terrain of that landscape started to change. In the late 1980s, during the Ronald Reagan administration, you had the repeal of what was called the Fairness Doctrine, which was a regulation in America that mandated that opposing political viewpoints needed to be aired in commercial media. With that change in communications law, you had the rise of what we call right-wing, principally right-wing talk radio, which was one political point of view, just very vocally presented, the most famous of which, again in America, would be Rush Limbaugh, who was really, his entire media empire was enabled by this change in regulation that allowed for conservative talk radio. But you had other changes as well. You had the growth of cable television and satellite television, and suddenly you didn't need to be a broadcast news network to reach a relatively mass audience, to scale up to the point when a commercial television newscast would be a viable entity. So you had falling costs and change in regulation that really enabled the explosion in choice, and that's just been the last 30 plus years of American history. American media history has been the explosion of choice. So that's the fact, that's the reality. I think we could have a separate discussion perhaps later on what are the consequences or the impacts of that, the reality, but I think it's just, as a starting point, we should acknowledge that partisan media in the United States is the present. Now, I think one notion that I've really been thinking a lot about is, what does it mean, now that we know that partisan media is a fact of life, what does it mean to be a partisan media outlet? What is your agenda? Is your agenda to serve one political party or another, or is your agenda to have a sort of pretty fairly well-defined worldview that you look out, a lens through which you look out at the world at, and you filter the stories and the way you present your stories and the way you report your stories through that worldview, but you're not trying to necessarily advance one side or the other. It's more issue-based media, and I think there's a kind of confusion when we say partisan media. We'll talk about, well, does this media help the Republican Party in the United States, or does it help the Democrat Party in the United States? I think that, in a certain way, can be a simplistic and a binary way to look at it. I think a more sophisticated and nuanced way to approach this whole conversation would be to try to understand, is a certain media organization advancing an agenda that is unique to them, or are they trying to help the political, move the ball down the political field? And so that's sort of another point that we could get to. And then I think one of the other fascinating points that has been a new development in this present partisan media climate, especially with the rise of conservative media, is this sort of crosstalk that now exists in American media, which is really rose up from the conservative media talking to the quote, mainstream media, which in their parlance is the liberal media, or as Sarah Palin might say, the lamestream media. But this whole idea that, you know, there is so much now crosstalk where conservative media will take a story that has been covered in the major American newspapers or on the broadcast networks or on CNN or MSNBC, and they will either debunk it, they will challenge it, they will amplify it, but there is now a conversation taking place that it's almost like a tug of war, which again, this development, I would argue, is a rise of a result of the rise of conservative media, because they were speaking to their audience. One way they built an audience was to say, listen, you can't trust what you are reading in the three major American newspapers of national significance, or the broadcast networks, or CNN. In the 1990s, Rush Limbaugh called CNN the Clinton News Network. There was just this whole industry that was created around delegitimizing the existing media order to build trust and cohesion amongst the audience on the right. So I think that is a reality we live in now, and I think a fascinating conversation again down the line will be, is that well serving audiences on both sides, audiences of all media outlets. I mean, it seems a little bit of inside baseball at times when you turn on cable news and you have Fox News talking about what's on MSNBC and MSNBC talking about what's on Fox News, and you have to wonder sometimes, does their audience, aren't they just feeling a little bit lost in all of this crosstalk? But anyways, that is something that the programmers of both those networks feel will appeal to their audiences. And I think another, now just pivoting a bit to look to the future, if we acknowledge that partisan media is the present, I think the biggest change that we will see in the next near term will be the fracturing of the media on the right. I mean, I think the major development that has taken place in the United States since the late 1980s through the change in regulation and the commercialization of conservative media has been the rise of these sort of mass dominant audiences on the right. You have Rush Limbaugh in talk radio, you have Fox News in television media, but you're starting to see, with the rise of online video and the growth of conservative news websites, a fracturing of that audience. And I think over the next 5 to 10 years, the biggest shift in the media landscape is going to be the fracturing of the audience on the right. And then that will be fascinating to see how that changes the media dynamic, because they will, some of the same forces that have fractured the mainstream audience will then be exerted on the conservative audience, and to see what new ideas and what new sensibilities and perspectives will bubble out of that. All of that change will be fascinating. Anyways, well, I'm looking forward to taking questions, but really the thrust of my book in reporting on the history of Fox News and the man who created it, Roger Ailes, is to try to understand this monumental shift over the last 4 decades, which is the rise of a conservative media establishment and how it's changed American politics, and looking ahead to the implications for the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gabriel. We'll have an opportunity to tease out some of those issues when we get to the question and answer session.